Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. And welcome, Jonathan Stubbs from Cyprus International University. He will give a speech to us today. And I'm glad that he made it today. Let me just shortly introduce him. He holds a PhD in film studies from the University of East Anglia from 2007. He's in the communications faculty in Cyprus International University. And his research focuses on history in film, but I think more precisely British history in film, especially, and American. Film policy, the economic and cultural relationship between Hollywood and the British film industry. And since he's in Cyprus, on the history of media in Cyprus during the British colonial period. He has authored several books. For example, Hollywood and the Invention of England, Projecting the English Past in American Cinema, 1930 to 2017, Bloomsbury Academic, and Historical Film, A Critical Introduction, also in Bloomsbury. And yes, he's a good friend of mine, and I'm glad that he accepted the invitation. Actually, I thought due to the PhD level course cultural heritage and conservation that I teach to one student who is luckily present. This would be a good subject to add, but for a wider audience. Okay. Now the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, Marco. Thank you for coming. You can hear me okay, I think?
Yeah.
I'm going to be standing sort of slightly at an angle so I can see the screen, so I hope that won't look too strange. But yeah, this is some research I did 4 or 5 years ago. I've kind of come back to it recently, looking at cinema going in Cyprus from a different perspective. I'll come back to that later. So I'm kind of returning to something that's a little bit old, but something which I still think is interesting and relevant to the topic of cultural heritage, which is what I was invited to talk about. So my title here is Cinemas and Cinema Going as Intangible Heritage, Turkish Cypriot Audiences under British Colonial Rule in the 1950s. So what does it mean to talk about cinema going as a kind of heritage? We can talk about 2 dimensions of heritage, I guess. We can talk about tangible heritage, which is the spatial dimension of heritage, the built environments, the built cinemas, for example, if they still exist. But we can also talk about this in terms of an intangible heritage. This is the heritage that is embodied in people rather than in inanimate objects. So that means memory, and in particular, oral history. And I think this focus on cinema going as a kind of intangible heritage connects to a reorientation in film history that's been ongoing in the last sort of 20 years or so towards what's sometimes called new cinema history. So not film history, but cinema history. And that means focusing not on films themselves as such, and not on the industry that produces films, but rather on cinema as a social practice, as a leisure activity, something that people are engaged in as a way of spending their private time. And if you kind of put that focus on cinema going rather than on films itself, it involves many more people. The number of people involved in making films is relatively small. The number of people involved in consuming films, in viewing films, is much, much larger. So this kind of reorientation towards cinema going as a social practice kind of widens up film studies to take a much larger range of experiences into account. Richard Maltby has been one of the big voices in this change, and he's written, for most audiences, for most of the history of cinema, their primary relationship with the cinema has not been with individual movies as artifacts or texts, but with the social experience of cinema. So that's what I'm interested in here today, the social experience of going to the movies. Maltby also advocates for what he calls micro-historical studies of cinema going around the world to complement, extend, and to qualify the broader generalizations that people make to characterize film history. So he's in favor of locally focused histories, which can deepen our understanding of how, quote, citizen consumers explain themselves and their place in the world through their encounters with forces of global and globalizing culture. So this kind of brings me to my microhistory, my example of a microhistory of cinema going, and that is the Turkish Cypriot audience in Nicosia in the 1950s. So that really is a small audience. You know, there were maybe 10,000 Turkish Cypriots in Nicosia during this period. So it's a very small sample, but I think it allows us to think about what cinema was as a social experience. And in this particular political context, how it was shaped by broader external forces, such as nationalism, such as colonialism, such as political violence, and also by a broader encounter with modernity. So cinema was the dominant leisure activity in Cyprus during the 1950s, at least the dominant kind of commercial leisure activity. According to one report I read, in 1952, Nicosia had more cinemas per head than in Paris. I'm not certain how to interpret that statistic, but it's certainly true there were a lot of cinemas in Nicosia during that decade. That's a reflection of the city's ethnic diversity, but also of a kind of social stratification in the city as well. Around 30% of Nicosia was occupied by Turkish Cypriots at this time. That's higher than the other cities in Cyprus during that time. And Nicosia was home to about 14% of the total number of Turkish Cypriots on the island during that period. And cinema was very much part of everyday life. It was a common leisure activity. And I think a reflection of that is in 1957, the colonial government used the price of cinema tickets to calculate inflation. So a common way for governments to calculate inflation is to take like a basket of goods and see how the price of those goods changes over time. So in the sort of basket of goods used to make these retail price calculations, a cinema ticket was included alongside vegetables and kerosene. So it was like a very common experience to buy a cinema ticket. As you might expect, cinema going was entangled in political violence after 1955, and cinemas provided easy prey for arsonists and assassins. And there are many reports of assassinations occurring in cinemas during the late 1950s, particularly in Nicosia. This is one of them. So this is reported in a British newspaper in 1955. There was an attempt to assassinate the governor of Cyprus, the British governor of Cyprus, with a bomb in, I can't remember which cinema it was, it doesn't say, but one of the main cinemas, one of the main sort of Greek Cypriot-owned cinemas in Cyprus, there was an attempt to assassinate the governor with a bomb that was left under a seat. Unsuccessful attempt. But it kind of shows how, as a sort of a public activity, it became entangled with political violence that was ongoing during that period. And I would say the experiences of Turkish Cypriot cinema goers in the 1950s were defined by four broad relationships. So firstly, there was a relationship with the British colonial government in a time of political upheaval and a time of violence. Cinema also involved a relationship with the Greek Cypriot community, particularly as these two communities started to come into conflict. Cinema also involved a relationship with Turkey itself, particularly as Turkish nationalist politics started to take hold in Cyprus. And fourthly, it involved a relationship within the Turkish Cypriot community itself, particularly at a time of separation from the Greek Cypriot majority and an increasing orientation towards the Turkish motherland. So let me just briefly talk about the method that we used in this study. This is based mainly on oral history interviews that were done with 20 subjects born between 1918 and 1950, all based in Nicosia, all had lived in Nicosia during the 1950s. And we were guided by work by Annette Kuhn, which was done on cinema audiences in Britain. She writes, when informants tell stories about their youthful film going, they are producing memories in specific ways, in a particular context. They are doing memory work, staging their memories, performing them. And I think what this means is that, you know, when people conduct oral history, when people sort of record the memories of their subjects, they shouldn't be taken entirely at face value. They are texts which need to be evaluated on their own terms. These interviews were conducted by my co-author, Barçın Boğaz. I can't speak Turkish, so he conducted these interviews, and he is responsible for this part of the study. Oral history material, as I said, should not be treated simply as data relating to the social practice of cinema going. It's also a kind of discourse relating to the subjective processes of memory. So in order to kind of triangulate the information we gathered through the oral history process, we took information from other sources. And this was mainly newspapers, so mainly Turkish Cypriot newspapers, advertisements that were placed for cinemas in the Turkish Cypriot press during this period, and also by records that were left by the British colonial administration. So a fairly large amount of record keeping relating to cinema is available in the state archives of Nicosia, and we were able to use that to kind of provide balance to the information that was gathered through the oral history process. So briefly, what I'm going to talk about today. Firstly, I will give an overview of cinema as a social practice and as a business in Cyprus in the 1950s, mainly focusing in Nicosia. Secondly, I'll talk about how cinema operated as a kind of contact zone. And I'll talk about the ways in which cinema brought Turkish Cypriots into contact with other cultures. Thirdly, I'll talk about cinema as a kind of social space, the role of cinema going in social formation, particularly in a period of ethnic partition. And finally, I'll talk about cinema as a political and a national space, particularly the direct and indirect role of cinema in the wider intercommunal conflict of the late 1950s. So according to local accounts, the first films to be shown in Cyprus, the first exhibitions were made by a Turkish Cypriot called Mustafa Ali, and they were organized in Nicosia in around 1930. Mustafa Ali had visited America according to stories that have been published, and he came back with a projector and he organized the first film shows in a indoor location in Nicosia. Later on, these film shows were moved outdoors, particularly in Sarionis Square. So this was the venue of some of the first outdoor film shows that were seen in Cyprus. And this goes back, over 100 years. Later developments in film exhibition in Cyprus were led by Greek Cypriot businessmen. One important cinema, which is not entirely a cinema, it was the Papadopoulos Theatre that was built in Nicosia in the 1890s within the walls of the old city. It was a theatre, it was designed for live performances, but cinema screenings were gradually added to the repertoire of shows that were performed in this space. So being built in the 1890s, that's a little bit early for cinema, but as cinema kind of emerged as a popular entertainment, cinema was sort of added into this space that was built for different purposes. And unfortunately, this cinema or this theatre is no longer standing. I know roughly where it's located, but I think it might be a car park at this point. Also in Nicosia, we have the Magic palace theatre, as you can see from the style. As you might guess from the style, this was also constructed by a Greek Cypriot businessman. Built in 1926 outside the city walls, and it was a large space. This contained over 1,000 seats, but it too has been demolished. And again, the site is available, but it's kind of hard to see exactly where the cinema would have stood. This kind of space outside the city walls has been redeveloped considerably since the early 20th century. Somewhat more recently, we have the Palace Cinema that was built in Nicosia in the late 1940s. And this actually is there still. It was recently refurbished with funding from the EU and the States and converted into a concert hall. So no longer showing films, but still active as a somewhat elevated space for leisure activities. These are all kind of indoor cinema spaces, but a lot of the time when people were watching films in Cyprus during the 1950s, they would have been outdoors. And there was a distinction made between covered and open-air cinemas. Covered cinemas were known as winter palaces. They could operate year-round. They could show films in the afternoon, which wasn't possible in an open-air cinema because it was daylight. You can't show films if it's daylight. But they didn't have any air conditioning. So I think they would have been pretty uncomfortable during the summer months. So winter palaces operated mainly in the winter. And cinema or theatre companies would often have a winter palace next to a summer palace. A summer palace was an open-air cinema, much cheaper to build. So no need for walls all around it, a projector and a screen, and maybe some kind of way of regulating attendance. These would operate mainly in the summer months. I think around May, they would generally open in Cyprus, but only after dark. So you couldn't show films until it became dark. So I would guess it would be difficult to show more than one film a day in an open-air cinema during the summer, because 9 o'clock is when it's dark enough to show a film. Probably just time for one performance each day. Local entrepreneurs with overseas trading contracts were essential to the growth of the cinema business in Cyprus. In the 1930s, the majority of films were imported from Greece. In the early 1940s, as war disrupted trade routes, films mainly came from Egypt and from Palestine. So Cyprus was kind of connected to trade networks across the Mediterranean. Most of the films that were shown in Cypriot cinemas were American films, and this may reflect audience taste, but I think it also reflects the fact that the American film industry had a much higher level of output than any other film industry in the world. I think audiences in Cyprus may have preferred Greek and Turkish films, but the rate of production in Greece and Turkey was low. So even though audience may have preferred to see films in those languages, there weren't enough of them to kind of fill up the schedules of cinemas in the country. We can get some sense of where films came from with these figures. This covers 1935 up to 1947, and it kind of shows where films were imported from. This is data that was collected by the Board of Censorship under British colonial rule during this period. And it shows that the great majority of films that came into Cyprus were from the USA. During the early 1940s, when film production was disrupted by the Second World War, that was kind of one of the only places where films could be produced. So look at the year 1943. You have 2 films from the UK, and everything else came from the USA. We can also see a fairly large number of films from Britain and also from France, and you can see a number of films being imported from Turkey and Greece. This shows there was demand for Greek and Turkish films in Cyprus, but those film industries were not well developed during this time. So there weren't a large number of films available to be imported, despite the demand from the audience. The cinema industry in Cyprus grew rapidly in the 1950s. It was dominated by 4 large Greek Cypriot cinema companies, Kyprianou, Papadopoulos, Pallas, and Lakoudi. They all own several venues around the island. The government estimated that around 150 films were, or each of these companies imported about 150 films each year, which is a large number. And that every cinema showed a new film every 2 or 3 days, which I think is surprising. So these cinemas were changing the film that they showed, not once a week, but every 2 or 3 days. So 2 or 3 times a week, they would show a new film. So there was clearly a very high demand for new films. And this is, I think, why so many films came from Hollywood, because it was only really the American film industry that was making enough films to offer regular new content to fill the screens in these cinemas. People wanted a new film, every 2 or 3 days. So there had to be a high level of import to meet that audience demand. A sense of the industry's growth can be seen in the amounts that were raised by the entertainment's license, which was paid by each cinema to the municipal government. So I think the actual amount is not so important, but I think what's interesting is how the amount of tax paid by cinemas increased and when it increased. So we can see during the early 1950s, the amount of money paid by cinemas in tax goes up quite a lot, which tells us that more cinemas were being opened. It sort of goes down in 1956 and 1958. This I would assume is a reflection of intercommunal violence or anti-colonial violence. So 1958 in particular was a year where there were many curfews in Nicosia, so it would have been difficult for cinemas to operate. So I think the dip that we see in the taxes paid by cinemas is a reflection of that sort of larger political situation. So yeah, as this sort of tax suggests, the British colonial government was heavily involved in regulating cinema going in Cyprus during this period. Every film that was imported to the island had to be passed by the Cyprus Board of Censorship, which was established in 1933. Every film import was taxed at 15% if it was a British film, and at 30% if it was a film from anywhere else in the world. So there was like a benefit to importing British films. If cinemas were suspected of showing unlicensed material, then the police were allowed to raid the cinema and seize the material. Other laws affected cinemas and cinema going more directly, particularly the curfew laws that were imposed under the sort of the larger emergency laws. So at different times between 1955 and 1959, there were quite heavy curfews that prevented people from going out at night. And of course, that would have made attending cinemas very, very difficult. In April 1956, every Greek Cypriot owned bar, cafe, cinema, and shop in the whole of Nicosia was closed for 1 week, apparently in response to the killing of a police officer. And there are numerous other examples of kind of forced temporary closures of cinemas. They were widely recognized as a kind of collective punishment, mainly against the Greek Cypriot community. But of course, it affected Turkish Cypriots and Turkish Cypriot cinema goers as well. So the colonial state had a heavy role in regulating people's experience of attending cinema, and also the business of operating a cinema and importing films into the country. Imported Turkish films increased a great deal during the early 1950s, catering to a Turkish Cypriot audience at a time of rapid growth in the Turkish film industry. So we get to the early Yeşilçam period. So higher rates of film production can be seen in Turkey, and more of those films come to be imported into Cyprus. The Turkish Cypriot film market was developed initially by Greek Cypriot and also Armenian Cypriot businessmen who had trading contacts in Istanbul. So the first cinemas that were catering to a Turkish Cypriot audience were not owned by Turkish Cypriot companies. Towards the end of the 1950s, we can see more cinemas opening in Turkish Cypriot neighborhoods and more cinemas being taken into Turkish Cypriot ownership. In particular, the Çağlayan neighborhood in northern Nicosia becomes a kind of a leisure center within the Turkish Cypriot community of Nicosia. And it has 5 cinemas as well as sort of bars and cafes located close together. So this is one of them, which you may have driven past. This is the Zafer Cinema, currently derelict in Nicosia, built initially by an Armenian, built and initially operated by an Armenian businessman in 1956, and then taken into Turkish Cypriot ownership in circumstances which may be suspicious 1 or 2 years after that. Nearby, we also have the Taksim Cinema. This is Marco's photo, actually. This was built in 1957, and it stood derelict for quite a long time until about 5 years ago when this was knocked down. I guess they're going to build something else in that spot. And this is where they were located. So we kind of get this concentration of Turkish Cypriot owned cinemas in a sort of a space within northern Nicosia. So these 5 or 6 cinemas opened during the late 1950s, kind of creating a leisure district. And this is a great photo of people, in the Çağlayan neighborhood, between cinemas, perhaps, or maybe just enjoying the air. If you go to this neighborhood now, I think the only kind of remnant of that is the Budak Patisserie, which, according to their logo, was opened in 1956. So this is kind of perhaps the last sort of surviving element of that sort of leisure district that we have today. If we turn to the oral history now, we can sort of think about how cinema was remembered by different people who participated in this culture during the early 1950s. And something that comes across quite a lot in interviews, as you might expect, is the idea of cinema as an escapist activity, something that transported viewers into alternate worlds. So one of our correspondents said, the first feature film that we watched were in English. We did not understand what they were saying, but it was not important. Those scenes of action and adventure were taking us to different places. We were living inside the film, not with its language, but with what we saw and felt. So this idea of cinema kind of transporting people, taking people somewhere else, not on the level of language, but on a different level of experience. Probably he's referring to Hollywood films, but other people that were interviewed spoke about watching Indian and Egyptian films as well during this time. Cinema also brought audiences into contact with Turkey. So another person said there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm in the theatre when we watched the first Turkish films. We, our friends and families, went and watched the films over and over again. The film characters were like us. They were Turkish. They were not actors whose lips did not move with their voice. They were not wearing strange clothes and making jokes that we didn't understand. So there's kind of a sense of recognition which is expressed here. And I think the reference to actors whose lips did not move to their voice, it suggests they're talking about films that were dubbed into Turkish. So maybe English films that were dubbed into Turkish. They weren't convinced by that dubbing, but they were convinced by seeing Turkish people talking Turkish and wearing clothes that they recognized when they were watching films. Several people that we spoke to recalled visiting the larger Greek Cypriot-owned cinemas in Nicosia. One person said, we were afraid to go to the first film screenings, but we were very curious about what was happening inside. The astonishment on the faces of the people leaving the cinemas and their excited conversations about what they had seen made us even more curious. So that's not a memory of actually going to the cinema, watching a film. It's a memory of sort of standing outside the cinema and watching the faces of people as they leave. But in fact, Greek Cypriot cinemas were widely used by the Turkish Cypriot community during the 1950s. In 1954, for example, the Palace Cinema, which I showed you a picture of earlier, screened 2 World Cup matches featuring the Turkish national team. I think there would have been highlights. There would have been like an edited reel of highlights from the games that the Turkish national team played in the 1954 World Cup. And they advertised them prominently in the Turkish language press. So not only were Greek Cypriot cinemas showing, Turkish football matches, they were using the Turkish Cypriot press to advertise them to the Turkish Cypriot community. So they were deliberately seeking customers from the Turkish Cypriot community. In fact, if you check the newspapers, Greek Cypriot cinemas like the Palace, like the Magic Palace, they regularly advertised in Turkish Cypriot newspapers until 1958, until early 1958. So this kind of commercial relationship between Greek Cypriot cinemas and the Turkish Cypriot audience, it continued even during the initial period of political violence in Cyprus. Turkish Cypriot cinemas were remembered as very simple, very plain spaces. One of our correspondents said, there was almost nothing. The whole thing was a movie, an empty space, and a white sheet. They're not kind of remembered as sort of luxurious, exotic spaces, rather as something very simple. But the memories of the kind of social interactions within these spaces were quite vivid. Cinema going was almost always remembered as a communal, collective experience. And one thing that came across very clearly from the interviews is that people always use the pronouns we and us, much more than the pronouns I or me. So when they're kind of remembering the experience of cinema going, it's remembered as something communal, something public, something shared, not as an individual experience. So as Bill Teresta and others have said, cinema going was more strongly influenced by community identity formation, class and social distinction than by individual movies and movie stars. So this is kind of consistent with observations that researchers have made in other national communities. Related to this, the idea of cinema going is often remembered as an egalitarian experience and cinema as an egalitarian space. So another correspondent said, doctors were coming to the cinema as well as civil servants, housewives, farmers, even 80-year-olds and small children. Nobody was saying, why are you here? Or you can't go in to anyone. They didn't, and why would they? So at a time when social space in Cypriot cities was segregated by gender, by class, by ethnicity, cinemas tended to be more inclusive, relatively speaking, than coffee shops, for example. And the writer Anita Bakshi, who's done oral history research in Nicosia, she's described Nicosia during this period as a series of overlapping public and private zones rather than a single shared space. But relative to other kind of public and private spaces, it seems that cinemas were somewhat more inclusive in terms of gender and in terms of class identity. Gender did play a big role in the regulation of the social space of cinema. There is evidence that male and female cinema goers were treated differently. Some cinemas charged lower prices to women, I guess presumably to try to encourage female attendance. Some cinemas programmed women's matinee screenings, so film performances that were intended to specifically appeal to female audiences. So at a time when many public buildings were used only by men, cinemas provided a somewhat socially acceptable venue for men and women to share the same social space. As a result of this, I think cinema going was remembered as a key element in many courtship rituals. So this is a longer quote from somebody that we spoke to. She says, the youth of the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s fed their souls with films and the atmosphere of cinema going. Young ladies and gentlemen had the opportunity to see each other while walking on Charlotte Street. Love letters were secretly and clumsily passed from hand to hand while walking. Every romance shown on the screen was understood by young lovers as a form of teaching. So we get the idea that the social experience of cinema going was not just the film itself, it was also the space around the cinema, the journey to and from the cinema. This was an opportunity for people to socialize, for different kinds of interactions to occur. So it's not just the 2 hours you spend watching the film, it's the kind of the rituals that surround that kind of film viewing experience. And those rituals maybe allow greater opportunities for romantic interaction than you might have in other social spaces. It's also worth mentioning that cinemas were not just for films, they were multi-purpose entertainment venues, so various kinds of entertainment were organized in the same buildings as cinemas. So this is an advert for performances in the Zafer Cinema in Nicosia. And we can see performances by singers, magicians, belly dancers, even boxing and wrestling matches happening in these kind of shared public spaces. Also performances by schools. So school children would, put on their performances in cinemas. Turkish Cypriot cinemas became more politicized in the late 1950s amid intercommunal fighting and the violent repressions of the colonial administration. And cinemas were used for political speech making, either before films or during the intermission. And I imagine audiences wouldn't have been that excited to have the cinema performance interrupted by a speech by a politician, but it seems that was not an unusual experience. Cinemas were also used for political fundraising, with money being taken for organizations, including the TMT, from the people attending the screenings. In 1955, for example, the Istanbul Cinema in Nicosia raised money for a delegation who were traveling to London to defend the rights of the Turkish Cypriot community. And 2 years later, the Halk Cinema hosted an event to benefit the victims of an earthquake in Turkey. That was the Fethiye earthquake, which I looked up, and it was not a serious earthquake compared to the recent one, but money was raised in Cyprus and donated to benefit the victims of that earthquake. Despite this, political context, people we spoke to remembered cinema also as a way to kind of escape these political tensions. According to one person we spoke to, the Turkish Cypriot community were under the oppression of the colonial administration and the Greek Cypriots. These feelings were released in the dark theatre during the screening of Turkish films. Another person we spoke to, the same person who remembered the romantic experience of visiting the cinema, said this: when I was studying at the Victoria Girls High School in Nicosia, our head teacher was British. She was working for the colonial administration. On Monday mornings, we sang the British national anthem and hoisted the British flag in our classrooms. Even though we were children, our hearts were broken. So films which featured the Turkish flag or addressed national emotions were like sacred artworks for us. When we saw our flag or heard our national anthem in a film, we applauded strongly. So the viewing of Turkish films in this period is remembered as a kind of resistance, to colonial rule, as a resistance to Greek Cypriot domination. Even though these films were from overseas, they were still associated with a sense of national belonging and attachment, or sort of an emerging form of national attachment. It's worth noting that cinema going in Cyprus was not only an urban phenomenon. Some research that I'm working on now, again with Bosch and Boaz, has shown that cinemas operated even in quite small villages on the island. Treveri Generi has said that people researching cinema going should turn away from the bright lights of the urban towards the less well-lit and infinitely more variegated history of rural cinema going. So rural cinema going in Cyprus also deserves to be studied. As they suggest, it's definitely different to urban cinema going, much more varied and much harder to study because there's less of an archive to look at. The newspapers in Cyprus from the period don't really talk about the cinemas outside the main cities. And there's very little in the archive that could really sort of help us to understand cinema going outside, the 5 or 6 main cities of Cyprus. So we're much more dependent on oral history to kind of recover the experience, the heritage of cinema going in villages. But it was definitely something substantial. The Turkish Cypriot village of Mehmetcik, for example, in Karpaz, had a population of around 1,200 people, but it had 2 cinemas, which I think is amazing. So even with a tiny population, there were 2 cinemas. This was obviously a significant leisure activity, even though it was separated from the urban centres of Cyprus. In particular, we're looking at rural cinema going among Turkish Cypriots between 1963 and 1974, when most of the population, the Turkish Cypriot population, were living in enclaves, a time of social deprivation, political insecurity, and cultural isolation. So this kind of begs the question, how was the social practice of cinema going shaped by these very unusual political and economic circumstances? So we're kind of working on that at the moment. But just to return to Nicosia for the conclusion, Kuhn, Bilteres and Mears have said that memories of cinema going reference not only the inevitable lostness of the past, but also the literal erasure of the sites of those memories, the impossibility of visiting the places of one's youth. Similarly, Bakshi, writing about Nicosia, observes that the nature of the bonds between place and memory is drastically altered by conflict and disruption. And this seems particularly poignant in a Cypriot context. The memories of the people that we spoke to refer to a city and to a homeland which has been dismembered by political conflicts, as well as cinemas which have been destroyed or left to ruin. As one of our correspondents said, it was a world we have lost as a result of our self-interest, a world which we did not get back and will never find again. So once again, this memory is expressed communally. It's a collective rather than a personal loss. So in a lot of these, the stories that we collected, cinema going is essential to, or it's central to the recollection of the past. It's a reference point in people's youth as they recall events from when they were younger. But I think it also survives as a reference point for the present, as people try to understand their place in the present and how things have changed, over the years that they've been alive, going back to the 1950s and the 1960s. So it's a kind of a heritage from the past, but I think it's a heritage that is still live in the present, even though these cinemas don't exist. The memories still survive and play a sort of a formative role in the way that people think about their past and think about their own personal histories. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, not very long, so I can ask us some questions if you have any.
I don't have questions, just I want to thank you that you have that research and these conferences. Also, our in our village we have 3 cinema,
Uh-huh.
1 for open air,
Yeah.
and 2 for winter. And also the cinemas are using for wedding parties.
Right.
Okay. This is the
Which village is this?
Akıncılar.
Okay.
Still active, these cinemas at the moment.
And now it's not active.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Probably not since the 70s, right?
Pollution or economic conditions.
Mm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our cinema name is Ulus Cinema.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. This is not a big village, I think. But 3 cinemas, that is unusual, I think.
I took many pictures of your presentation for making some documents about my village too. Also,
So
you can
this is
come and
Georgina,
visit.
the other name
Yeah,
is Georgina.
yeah. This has been published, so you can look up the article. So most of this is in the article that was published. So I can give you the reference for that if you like. But yeah, I think that it is something that is striking to me that there are so many cinemas in the Turkish Cypriot community in Cyprus. You know, from the period 50s, 60s, 70s. The open cinemas were not expensive to build. You don't need walls or a roof. It's like a projector and a screen. And you know, people bought their own chairs or they sat on the floor. So they were not difficult to build, but if there's competition within a village to show films, that shows that there's very strong sort of public interest, or there was at that time. This may be related to the fact there wasn't television for Turkish Cypriots until relatively recently. You know, CBC started broadcasting television in the late 1950s, but I think there wasn't much Turkish language content for people. And then after 1963, there's no television for quite a long time. So around the world, the arrival of television killed off cinemas, or certainly reduced its as an industry. That probably took a bit longer to happen for Turkish Cypriot. So that may be one reason. But I think it's not the only explanation. So it's something I'm still trying to figure out. But yeah, I mean, you can see really quite big cinemas in very small villages. It doesn't seem to make sense economically, but they're there. You know, you can count the chairs. They were big cinemas for hundreds of people in a village with maybe 1,000 people. So how did it work? Did everybody go? Did people come from the other villages to attend? Were they empty? I don't know. But it's interesting. Yeah.
Is there any information about what type of movies they were showing, like maybe kind of genre, or because when I'm thinking about Iran, I know that at some point women didn't like to go to some of the films because there were many sexual scenes and these kind of things. So is there any information about that, knowing that maybe that's one of the reasons that they made the price cheaper for women? Is there any information about
I mean, reading between the lines, I would say that's why maybe more conservative families were sort of regarded cinema as something that was not so suitable for women. People didn't talk that much about the actual films. They talked about loving the experience, but they maybe talked about certain stars, but the actual films they watched, that seems to be like a second level of importance. Westerns were mentioned quite a lot, which is a very male genre, I guess. But that's, you know, during the 1950s, that was the biggest genre in the American film industry. So you know, a lot of the imports would have been low-budget Westerns. Yeah, not that many people mention specific films. If we look at what Hollywood was producing during that time, there were a lot of kind of romantic films that were aimed at women. I assume they would have been imported. But yeah, I think some sort of conservative attitudes may have inhibited some women from attending as much. And yeah, as you say, lowering the prices was a way for cinema owners to try and get a bigger audience to come in. Not for ideological reasons, just for business reasons, I think. Yeah.
I know we're talking about the screen, but I have another question. How about the production part of the Cyprus? Because as we know, Michael Kakoyannis, which is a Zorbaz director, from Limassol. He went to England to study at BBC. Then he produced. Are there examples of some Cypriots? Doesn't matter, Turkish or Greek. Went to England or US and produced then screen in the Cyprus maybe, because those times maybe they didn't have production part in Cyprus.
Yeah.
But we have an example like Michael Capoyanis. So are there any movies produced in UK by the Cypriots and screened here, or you don't know?
This would take us into the 1960s. So in Greek Cypriot cinemas, I expect so. I mean, Michael Kakianis, I think, only made one film in Cyprus, and that was the documentary about 1974. There were a few other sort of Greek Cypriot directors. Michael Papas made some films in Britain, and later made one film in Cyprus. But if you're making films in Britain or somewhere else in Europe, you probably wouldn't want to come back to Cyprus because there was such a small production sector. So I think the directors who left generally stayed out of the country, just for
Or
seeking opportunities.
Maybe
elsewhere.
Turkish Cypriot directors went to Turkey and produced on some.
I'm not aware of any Turkish Cypriot directors apart from.
That's why I'm
David
saying
Simon.
I don't
That's
know
much later.
those times.
Yeah.
Maybe there is one or two, but we don't know.
Yeah, I've not come across any. Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, there were some film training facilities that were set up during the 1950s. So the British colonial government set up a documentary training centre in Nicosia in Küçükçamaklı. There was like a documentary training school, and that brought in students from lots of different countries. So from all over Eastern Africa and the Middle East, from different British colonies, to sort of learn how to make British-style documentaries in Cyprus. None of the students, I think, went on to have significant careers as film directors, unfortunately. But this kind of was part of the, I guess, a British attempt to create propaganda. I think, because the kind of documentaries they were making were sort of teaching videos to teach people how to drive more safely on the roads or how to sort of look after animals better.
Of course,
But not feature films.
Until the 1990s, all cinema were propaganda actually. So
Well,
those times
I'm
probably was
talking
more,
about documentaries. But
yeah.
yeah. I mean, really, how many countries had film industries until the 1970s? Not many,
Yeah.
and not many small countries. So it shouldn't be too surprising that Cyprus has never had a sort of its own film industry. I think.
Still, we don't have.
Yeah, exactly. How many countries do? It's you need to be a relatively large country to sort of sustain a film industry, I think.
I might have missed it. You concentrated mainly on the 1950s. Why is that? I mean, why did you choose the later period? Now you're studying the later period, but you're studying it with the villages now.
Yeah. So one reason was there was this information in the archive from the 50s, which you don't have from the 1960s.
Okay.
So there are sort of fairly good records kept by the British administration. Less so after 1955, after the emergency period. I think there's less because a lot of stuff was destroyed for political reasons. But between the 40s and the early 50s, there's a lot of good data. So there was this censorship board that checks every film that came into the country. So you can actually see the precise numbers of films that came into Cyprus. And we can also read the information about taxation and about even building regulations for cinema. So that all helps us to put these oral histories into a more tangible framework, if you like. So for this project, that was useful. But yeah, looking at rural cinema, it's a much less ordered territory. So it's a lot less. There are fewer kind of fixed reference points to sort of navigate that territory.
I found it interesting what you said about 1950s social spaces where people can meet, basically across ethnicities, across genders. And from what I somehow remember from my own studies, the only comparable space is actually the Hans. Yeah, and also Anita Bakshi was
Yeah,
writing
yeah.
about the Hans in Nicosia, that they were spaces where at least the men across the ethnicities would regularly meet and communicate also.
Yeah, and there were shops as well. Bakshi writes about shops.
Mm.
People would trade with each other.
Mm.
You know, there were Greek Cypriot shops that Turkish Cypriots would go to,
Mm.
and vice versa to a lesser extent. But then, of course, when you get into the late 1950s, there were efforts to stop those kind of contacts. There was the, I can't remember what it's called, From Turk to Turk campaign, which said that Turkish Cypriots should only buy from other Turkish Cypriots and not, visit Greek Cypriot shops. So that kind of, I think, was a recognition of the contact that did exist,
Yeah.
commercial contact between the communities, and it was an attempt to kind of, create a partition along those lines. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. And yes, one important thing.
Thank you very much.
The,
You gonna get a photo?
I'm not sure. Are we going to? Yes. So, the certificate.
Right. Thanks.